The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't gasp. It didn't move at all. For a fraction of a second, everything inside Judge Judy's courtroom froze in a way no one had ever seen before. No shouting. No banging gavel. Just a silence so thick it felt heavy, like the air itself had decided to stop breathing. Karen leaned forward. Not accidentally. Not impulsively. Deliberately. She stepped past the invisible boundary that every American courtroom understands without being told. Her lips tightened, her chin lifted with defiance, and before anyone could react, she spit directly toward Judge Judy's face. Time seemed to break. The bailiff, a man who had stood through screaming matches, threats, and outright meltdowns, didn't move. His hand hovered mid-air, instincts colliding with disbelief. The audience sat frozen on the benches, eyes wide, unsure whether they had actually just witnessed what their minds were struggling to process. And the cameras, those unblinking, unforgiving cameras, kept rolling. No one yelled. No one rushed forward. No one said a word. Because this wasn't just disrespect. This wasn't even contempt in the usual sense. This was something that crossed into a territory so rare, so unthinkable, that even seasoned courtroom veterans didn't immediately know how to react. In the entire history of Judge Judy's courtroom, people had insulted her, mocked her, talked over her, and underestimated her. But no one had ever done this. And what happened next didn't just end a case. It destroyed a life. Judge Judy didn't wipe her face. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even blink right away. She simply looked at Karen with an expression so calm, so controlled, that it sent a chill through the room. It was the kind of look that didn't promise anger. It promised consequences. Because what the audience didn't yet understand, what Karen clearly didn't understand, was that the spit wasn't even the worst thing she'd done that day. This wasn't a woman having a bad moment. This wasn't someone pushed too far. This was the final act of someone who had been crossing lines for a long time, and had finally stepped into a courtroom where lines are enforced. If you think there's a line you never cross in an American courtroom, stay with this story, and tap like, because what comes next restores faith in justice in a way you almost never get to see anymore. Karen stood there, breathing hard, clearly expecting chaos. Maybe she thought the moment would overwhelm the judge. Maybe she believed shock itself was power. Instead, she was met with something far more dangerous than anger: absolute control. The bailiff slowly lowered his hand, not because nothing was wrong, but because Judge Judy hadn't told him to move. The audience remained silent, not out of fear, but because something deep and instinctive told them this moment was about to change everything. Even Karen seemed unsure now, her confidence wobbling as she realized the courtroom wasn't reacting the way she expected. This wasn't television drama anymore. This was law. And somewhere beneath the surface of that stillness, something far bigger than a single act of contempt was about to come crashing down. Because Judge Judy wasn't just deciding how to handle what had just happened. She was deciding what to do with a pattern. One that had finally exposed itself on national television. What happens when contempt turns into a crime, broadcast live for millions to see? That answer was coming. And Karen was about to learn that in an American courtroom, the worst mistake you can make isn't losing your temper. It's underestimating the judge who's been waiting for you to cross the line. Karen didn't walk into the courtroom like someone afraid of consequences. She walked in like someone who had never truly faced them. She was 43 years old, impeccably certain of herself, and carried the kind of entitlement that doesn't come from money alone, but from believing the world is supposed to bend when you speak loudly enough. She introduced herself with practiced confidence, correcting pronunciation, emphasizing her credentials, and reminding everyone within earshot that she was well-educated, well-connected, and not the kind of person who gets pushed around. It wasn't confidence earned through discipline or achievement. It was superiority assumed. Karen didn't just think she was right. She believed she was untouchable. She spoke the way people do when they've spent years winning arguments by exhausting others. Every sentence came with an edge, every answer wrapped in condescension. When asked a simple question, she turned it into a lecture. When challenged, she smirked. When contradicted, she rolled her eyes as if the very idea of authority offended her. To Karen, rules were suggestions for other people. And this wasn't new. Long before she ever stood in front of Judge Judy, Karen had built a quiet but telling history, one she never mentioned unless forced to. Multiple small claims cases followed her name like a shadow. Former landlords. Former employers. Former neighbors. Different stories, same pattern. Karen always claimed she was the victim. Karen always claimed she was being targeted. And Karen always seemed to be standing in front of another judge, insisting she was smarter than the room. Court records showed repeated warnings for behavior. Interrupting judges. Speaking over attorneys. Ignoring courtroom protocol. She had been told, more than once, that respect in court was not optional. Each time she walked away convinced the problem wasn't her. It was the system. It was bias. It was incompetence. Outside the courtroom, the pattern became even clearer. Karen maintained a public social media presence where she vented freely, sometimes obsessively, about people she believed had wronged her. Judges were outdated. Service workers were lazy. Immigrants were ungrateful. Anyone in authority who didn't immediately validate her version of events was labeled corrupt or stupid. She framed herself as a truth-teller, a victim of a world that couldn't handle strong women, while simultaneously demeaning anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of worth. These weren't private thoughts. They were public rants. Screenshots. Videos. Posts that didn't disappear just because Karen wanted them to. And buried inside those rants was something more disturbing than arrogance. There was a belief that humiliation was a tool. That if you embarrass people loudly enough they would back down. That tactic had worked for her before. Managers apologized. Neighbors stopped pushing back. Clerks gave in just to end the confrontation. Over time, Karen learned a dangerous lesson. Escalation equals power. And she carried that lesson straight into the courtroom, convinced that intimidation would bend even a judge. What Karen didn't understand, what she had never encountered before, was a judge who didn't react emotionally. A judge who didn't rush to silence her. A judge who let her talk. Because while Karen was performing, something else was happening. Judge Judy wasn't engaging. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't correcting every exaggeration. She was listening. Watching. Letting Karen reveal herself, piece by piece in her own words. Every interruption. Every eye roll. Every sarcastic aside landed exactly where it needed to, on the record. That unusual calm wasn't patience. It was preparation. Karen mistook silence for weakness. She mistook restraint for hesitation. She believed she was controlling the room because no one was stopping her. In reality, she was being measured, evaluated, matched against a history she didn't know was already sitting in a folder within arm's reach. This wasn't a bad day spiraling out of control. This was a habit colliding with accountability. By the time Karen leaned forward in that courtroom, by the time she crossed the final line, Judge Judy already knew exactly who she was dealing with. Not just a rude litigant. Not just a difficult personality. But someone who had confused freedom of speech with freedom from consequences. And the reason Judge Judy had remained so calm earlier, the reason she hadn't raised her voice even once, was simple. She wasn't reacting to a moment. She was waiting for a pattern to finish revealing itself. And it was almost done. The person sitting across from Karen didn't look like someone chasing a payout. There was no confidence, no performance, no practiced outrage. Just a working-class American who had already learned what it feels like to be overwhelmed by a system that doesn't slow down for people without power. His name barely mattered to Karen. To her, he was just another obstacle, another person she believed she could pressure into backing down. But to the court, he was the reason the case existed at all. He had worked steady jobs his entire adult life. Not glamorous ones. Not high-paying ones. The kind of work that keeps cities running quietly, long hours, early mornings, calloused hands, and no margin for error. The kind of life where missing a paycheck doesn't mean inconvenience. It means panic. It means choosing which bill can wait and which one absolutely cannot. Karen had sued him after a dispute that should never have escalated. What started as a minor disagreement turned into something far more threatening the moment she realized she could use the court system as leverage. Letters followed. Then filings. Then demands. Each one more aggressive than the last. Each one carrying an unspoken message. I have more time, more energy, and fewer consequences than you do. For the victim, the threat wasn't abstract. It was immediate. If Karen won, even partially, he could lose his savings. The small emergency fund he'd built over years of discipline would be gone in a stroke of a pen. His home, modest but hard-earned, suddenly felt fragile. A judgment against him wouldn't just be money, it would be a mark on his record, something that followed him into future jobs, future rentals, future opportunities. Reputation mattered to him because it was all he had. While Karen spoke freely, loudly, confidently, he chose his words carefully. Not because he lacked a voice, but because he understood what was at stake if he misspoke. He answered questions directly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't exaggerate. He sat there absorbing Karen's insults with a restraint that came not from weakness, but from survival. Every time Karen scoffed or rolled her eyes, the contrast grew sharper. She spoke like nothing in that courtroom could truly touch her. He sat like everything depended on it, because it did. This case wasn't about pride for him. It was about stability. About not losing the ground he'd spent years clawing for. About proving that doing the right thing, even when someone louder tries to crush you, still mattered in an American courtroom. And yet, as the minutes passed, the imbalance became harder to ignore. Karen treated the court like a stage. She exaggerated details, reframed events, and painted herself as the injured party with theatrical flair. She spoke over questions. Corrected the judge. Smiled when the victim spoke, as if his words were an inconvenience rather than a defense of his own future. He, on the other hand, said less and revealed more. He talked about the stress, the sleepless nights, the fear of answering unknown numbers because he didn't know if it would be another threat or another demand. He described the way Karen's actions had followed him home, sat with him at dinner, and lingered in the back of his mind at work. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was pressure. It was intimidation. It was financial fear weaponized. And everyone in that courtroom could feel it. Judge Judy watched the exchange without interruption, eyes moving between the two of them. On one side, entitlement. On the other, quiet endurance. One person treated the court like a tool. The other treated it like a last line of defense. The truth was simple and brutal. This ruling could decide someone's future. For Karen, it was another fight she expected to win, or at worst shrug off. For the man sitting across from her, it was the difference between stability and ruin. Between walking out relieved or walking out burdened by a judgment that could take years to recover from. And as Karen continued to push, to posture, to provoke, she didn't realize she was doing something far more dangerous than insulting a judge. She was making it impossible to ignore who actually needed protection in that courtroom. One ruling away from ruin, that's where the victim sat. And in just a moment, when Karen finally lost control, everything about that balance was about to change. The shift in the room didn't come with a sound. It came with control. Judge Judy straightened slightly in her chair, not dramatically, not aggressively, but with a precision that signaled the end of tolerance. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had spent decades deciding where chaos stops. Answer the question, she said calmly. Not please. Not ma'am. Just the instruction. Karen reacted instantly. Her lips pressed into a thin smile, the kind people use when they believe they're smarter than the person across from them. She tilted her head, let out a small, dismissive laugh, and rolled her eyes as if the request itself were beneath her. It was subtle but not subtle enough to miss. Judge Judy didn't respond to the gesture. She didn't even acknowledge it. She simply waited. That silence unnerved Karen. She shifted in her seat, then began speaking again, longer this time, louder, layered with sarcasm. She reframed the question, dodged the substance, and drifted into a speech about how people like her were constantly misunderstood. Halfway through, Judge Judy cut in. I didn't ask you for a speech. Karen smirked. The smirk wasn't accidental. It was performative. It was the expression of someone who believed she was still winning. She leaned back, folded her arms, and let out an exaggerated sigh before responding, slowly, deliberately, as if explaining something obvious to a child. Judge Judy's expression didn't change. She looked directly at Karen and spoke with surgical clarity. You are not here to run this courtroom. That should have been the end of it. That was the warning. But Karen didn't hear caution. She heard challenge. She leaned forward slightly, hands gripping the edge of the table, posture shifting from seated defiance to something more confrontational. Her foot slid back. Her shoulders squared. The audience noticed before she did. The bailiff noticed immediately. Karen stood up. Not because she was told to. Because she wanted to. The movement drew a sharp inhale from the benches behind her. Standing in court without permission is not a misunderstanding. It's a statement. Karen knew that. And she did it anyway, eyes locked on Judge Judy with a look that said she believed height equaled dominance. Judge Judy raised her hand, not in anger but in finality. "Sit down." The command was quiet. Absolute. Karen didn't. Instead, she tilted her head again, a crooked smile creeping across her face, and said something under her breath, just loud enough to be heard. Another boundary tested. Another line nudged. That was when Judge Judy leaned forward. This time everyone felt it. She looked directly at Karen, her voice low and unwavering. "This is your last warning. You will sit down, you will answer the question, and you will conduct yourself properly, or you will be removed." There was no drama in her tone. No threat for effect. Just a clear explanation of cause and consequence. Karen hesitated. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like she might comply. Her eyes flicked toward the bailiff, toward the audience, toward the camera still recording every second of her unraveling authority. Then she smiled again, and stepped closer. Not far. Not aggressively. Just enough to make the movement unmistakable. Just enough to show she had decided defiance was her strategy. The courtroom went still. The victim sat motionless, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the table. The audience leaned forward unconsciously, sensing the shift from argument to something far more serious. The bailiff tensed, his posture changing, not reacting yet but preparing. Judge Judy didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't reach for the gavel. She simply watched Karen step into a space she could not step back out of. Because the warning had been given. The authority had been asserted. And Karen had just made a decision she could never undo. Everyone in the room felt it at the same time, the unmistakable sense that something irreversible was about to happen. Not because of what had already been said, but because of what Karen was about to do next. And once it happened, there would be no apology big enough, no excuse loud enough, and no explanation clever enough to save her from what followed. The line had been drawn. And Karen had just crossed it. Karen didn't shout. She didn't curse. She didn't throw anything. She leaned. It was a small movement, almost subtle, but in a courtroom even subtle movements carry weight. She leaned forward just enough to close the distance that never should have been closed. Her shoulders tilted, her chin lifted, and for a brief, suspended second, it looked like she might say something else. Another insult. Another challenge. Instead there was a sound. Soft. What? Sharp enough to cut through the silence. The spit left her mouth and traveled only a short distance, but it didn't need to go far. It landed where it never should have landed, crossing a line so absolute that the room seemed to recoil from it. The reaction was immediate, and yet frozen. The bailiff moved first, his body responding before his mind fully caught up. One step forward, posture shifting from watchful to protective. His hand came up, not touching Karen yet, but ready. Trained. Alert. The kind of movement that says this just became something else. From the benches, the audience gasped as one. Not a scream. Not chaos. Just a collective intake of breath, sharp and disbelieving, like a room full of people witnessing a rule of reality break in real time. No one spoke. And then all eyes turned to Judge Judy. She didn't flinch. She didn't wipe her face. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for the gavel. She did nothing. For a moment that felt far longer than it was, Judge Judy simply sat there, looking at Karen with an expression that was almost impossible to read. Not anger. Not shock. Something colder. Something heavier. Silence filled the room again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was understanding. Karen seemed to realize it too. The defiance on her face faltered just slightly. Her smile vanished. Her breathing quickened. She glanced sideways, then back as if expecting an explosion that never came. The absence of reaction unsettled her more than yelling ever could. Because when authority doesn't react emotionally, it's not losing control. It's deciding. The bailiff froze mid-step, waiting. The audience held their breath. The victim stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if afraid that even moving might somehow make things worse. Judge Judy still said nothing. That silence wasn't mercy. It was gravity. Karen shifted her weight, suddenly unsure of what she had accomplished. This wasn't how intimidation was supposed to work. She had expected outrage. She had expected chaos. She had expected the moment itself to be the power. Instead, she was standing alone in the aftermath of an act she could not take back. If you believe disrespect has consequences, especially in court, you'll want to stay till the end and hit subscribe because this case goes somewhere nobody expected. Finally, Judge Judy lowered her gaze, not away but down. Toward the papers on her desk. Toward the file that had been sitting there the entire time, untouched. The movement was slow. Deliberate. And when her eyes lifted again, the room understood something Karen still didn't. The spit wasn't the climax. Was the trigger. Judge Judy didn't ask Karen to apologize. She didn't lecture her. She didn't threaten her, not yet. She simply looked up, meeting Karen's eyes with a calm so absolute it bordered on unnerving. That was when the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't about disrespect anymore. This wasn't about decorum. This was about law. Spitting isn't speech. It isn't opinion. It isn't protected by bravado or excuses. It's an act. And on national television, in a courtroom governed by rules Karen had already been warned about, that act had consequences far beyond embarrassment. Karen opened her mouth as if to speak again, then closed it. The room seemed to lean away from her now instinctively. The energy had shifted. The power had moved. The cameras kept rolling, capturing not a dramatic outburst, but something far more devastating. The moment when someone realizes they've gone too far, and there is no rewind. Judge Judy still hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Because everyone in that room could feel it. The silence wasn't restraint anymore. It was calculation. And whatever Judge Judy was about to do next, it wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be permanent. Why wasn't she reacting? Because reactions are for moments you can move past. And this moment was already sealing Karen's fate. Judge Judy broke the silence by doing something that instantly changed the temperature of the room. She reached for the file. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of movement that signaled intention, not reaction. The thick folder slid toward her with a quiet sound against the desk, and in that moment Karen's posture shifted again, not forward this time but back. Something in her expression tightened, as if a part of her finally understood that the courtroom had moved on without her permission. Judge Judy opened the folder and glanced down. "This," she said calmly, tapping the page with one finger, "is not the first time you've behaved this way in a courtroom." Karen scoffed out of instinct, then stopped herself when Judge Judy continued without looking up. "According to these records, you've been warned for contempt-related behavior on 3 separate occasions." She flipped a page. Interrupting proceedings. Speaking over the judge. Refusing to follow basic courtroom instructions. Another page. And in one instance you were removed from the room. The air felt heavier now. Karen's earlier bravado had nowhere to go. She tried to interject. Just a word, just a sound, but Judge Judy lifted her hands slightly, not even looking at her. "I'm not finished." That was when the realization began to sink in. Judge Judy hadn't been calm earlier because she was ignoring Karen. She had been calm because she already knew who she was dealing with. The folder continued to open, page after page revealing a story Karen had carefully avoided telling. Complaints filed by former landlords. Documentation from employers. Written warnings. Emails. Patterns. Always the same tone. Always the same escalation. Always the same insistence that she was being wronged, paired with behavior that suggested otherwise. Judge Judy paused and looked up. "Do you deny sending these messages?" Karen swallowed. "Those were taken out of context." Judge Judy didn't respond to the excuse. She simply read aloud. Threats. Harassment. Demands phrased as ultimatums. Language that crossed from frustration into intimidation. And then something that made even the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. A recorded voicemail. Judge Judy summarized it without dramatizing a single word. A message Karen had left, her voice unmistakable, warning the victim that if he didn't fall in line, she would make his life miserable through legal action. That she had nothing to lose. That she was very good at this. Karen's face drained of color. The cameras hadn't just caught the spit. They had caught everything else too. Judge Judy closed the folder gently and folded her hands. "Do you understand," she said evenly, "that this case stopped being about your claim the moment you chose to behave this way?" Karen opened her mouth. Closed it. Tried again. "I was provoked." "No," Judge Judy said, cutting her off. "You were exposed." That was the pivot. The exact moment the legal ground shifted beneath Karen's feet. Judge Judy explained it plainly. Not as punishment, yet, but as fact. Karen's conduct in court, combined with documented evidence of harassment and intimidation, fundamentally changed the nature of the case. This was no longer a simple civil dispute. This was a pattern of abuse using the legal system as leverage. The case flipped. Karen was no longer the aggrieved party. She was the problem the court now had to address. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and precise. Courts exist to resolve disputes, not to be used as weapons. When someone demonstrates a repeated willingness to intimidate, harass, and disregard court authority, that person forfeits credibility. Karen shook her head, panic creeping into her movements. That's not fair. Judge Judy looked at her, unimpressed. Fair has nothing to do with it. Facts do. The victim sat silently, barely moving, as if afraid to believe what was happening. The audience watched in real time as the power dynamic they had witnessed earlier collapsed completely. Karen's confidence didn't erode slowly, it fell apart all at once. Judge Judy wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't lecturing. She was laying groundwork. Every word now served a purpose. She outlined how Karen's behavior constituted contempt. How the act itself, spitting, crossed into conduct that could not be dismissed as emotional outburst. How the documented pattern made it impossible to treat this as an isolated incident. Karen's earlier belief, that chaos was power, had finally betrayed her. This wasn't about spit anymore. It was about intent. And proof. Judge Judy closed the folder and looked directly at Karen, her expression unreadable but resolute. You didn't just lose control, she said. You revealed it. Karen's shoulders slumped slightly. Her eyes darted toward the cameras, toward the bailiff, toward anything that might signal a way out. There wasn't one. The courtroom wasn't waiting for an apology. It was waiting for consequences. And as Judge Judy prepared to speak again, this time not as a listener but as a decision-maker, one thing was clear to everyone watching. Whatever punishment was coming next was going to exceed the insult that started it all. Because the law doesn't measure disrespect by how shocking it looks. It measures it by what it proves. The decision didn't come with drama. It came with certainty. Judge Judy looked at Karen one last time, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with the detached clarity of someone who had reached a conclusion long before the other person realized the argument was already over. You are done, she said. The bailiff didn't hesitate this time. He stepped forward with purpose, placing himself between Karen and the bench. Karen reacted instantly, hands lifting, voice rising, protests spilling out in rapid bursts, but it no longer mattered. The moment she crossed that final line, she surrendered the privilege of being heard on her terms. She was escorted out of the courtroom. Not gently. Not violently. Just firmly, efficiently, and without ceremony. The audience watched in silence as the door closed behind her, the sound echoing through the room like a period at the end of a sentence that had gone on far too long. Judge Judy turned her attention back to the case. With respect to the claim, she said calmly, it is dismissed in its entirety. The victim blinked, barely registering the words at first. Furthermore, Judge Judy continued, given the documented pattern of harassment, intimidation, and misuse of the legal process, judgment is entered against the plaintiff. She explained it clearly. Precisely. No excess. Karen would not only receive nothing, she would pay. Court costs. Damages. The maximum allowable financial judgment under the circumstances. The numbers were laid out plainly and each one landed with weight. This wasn't symbolic justice. It was material. But Judge Judy wasn't finished. She addressed the behavior itself. The act that had transformed a civil dispute into something far more serious. Spitting in court wasn't just disrespect, it was conduct. Conduct that crossed into potential assault. Conduct that warranted referral. This matter, she said, will be forwarded for review. Not as a threat. As procedure. Karen's removal wasn't the end of her consequences. It was the beginning of them. Contempt findings. Possible charges. And a permanent ban from appearing again, not just because of what she did but because of what she represented. Someone who believed entitlement placed them above the law. The courtroom settled into a quiet that felt different now. Not tense. Not uncertain. Resolved. Judge Judy turned to the victim. You did the right thing by coming here, she said. And you did the right thing by letting the court handle it. The man nodded, visibly emotional but composed. Relief washed over him slowly, like something he didn't fully trust yet, but wanted to. When the camera stopped rolling, the story didn't. The clips spread across the country within hours. Americans from every background reacted the same way, not with shock at the spit, but with satisfaction at the response. Comment sections filled with a single theme. Finally. Finally, consequences. Finally, a reminder that courts are not stages for bullies. The victim spoke briefly afterward. Not to celebrate. Not to humiliate. But to say thank you. To the court. To the process. To the idea that fairness still exists when you need it most. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared from the narrative she had tried so hard to control. No triumphant statements. No viral clapbacks. Just the quiet aftermath of someone learning, too late, that power without accountability collapses the moment it's tested. And that's what this case was really about. Not spit. Not anger. Not even disrespect. It was about the difference between entitlement and authority. That's what happens, Judge Judy said earlier, summing it up in a way no one would forget, when entitlement meets accountability. If this ending felt right to you, if watching consequences land exactly where they should gave you a sense of relief, comment "Justice served," and make sure you're subscribed. Because in this courtroom there are always consequences.